Nathan Bedford Forrest was not born into military greatness. In fact, he was never meant to wear the uniform of a general at all. He had no formal military education, no West Point credentials to polish his reputation, and no aristocratic family to pave his way with privilege. He was a self-made man, a product of grit, raw instinct, and a willingness to do whatever it took to survive. Rising from poverty in the rugged hills of Tennessee, he transformed himself into one of the most feared and brutal generals of the American Civil War. His name became a warning whispered in Union camps. His raids came like storms. His tactics were lightning fast, unpredictable, and merciless. To fight against Forrest was to face a man who believed that mercy had no place on the battlefield. Forrest's early life shaped the iron edge of his character. Born in 1821 in rural Tennessee, he grew up in poverty with little formal education. His father died when Forrest was still young, leaving him responsible for helping his family survive. He worked wherever he could, on farms, in trades, and eventually as a horse trader. His natural toughness and cunning gave him an edge in business, and he quickly discovered that his instincts for bargaining and risk-taking could turn into serious wealth. By his mid-30s, Forrest was a prosperous planter and horse dealer, but the largest portion of his fortune came from the slave trade. It was brutal work, but it made him one of the wealthiest men in the South before the war began. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, many wealthy Southern men paid others to take their place in the ranks. Forrest did not. Despite having the money and the option, he enlisted as a private in the Confederate Army. Within months, his natural leadership and organizational skills earned him a commission. Within a year, he was promoted to colonel. By the time the war ended, Forrest had risen all the way to lieutenant general, the only man in the entire conflict, Union or Confederate, to climb from the rank of private to that high command. His rise was meteoric, driven not by education or connections, but by sheer ferocity, daring, and instinct. What made Forrest so terrifying was not just his ambition, it was his mind. He seemed to understand warfare on an almost primal level, seeing opportunities where others saw only defeat. He believed that battles were not won by elaborate formations or strict adherence to textbooks, but by speed, aggression, and surprise. He once declared, "Get there first with the most men." And although the phrase has often been simplified, it captured his essence. Forrest thrived on being faster than his enemy, appearing before they were ready, striking with overwhelming violence, and vanishing before they could recover. His cavalry became his weapon of choice, and he reshaped its use. Traditionally, cavalry was meant for scouting, flanking, or transporting officers. Forrest transformed his riders into shock troops, capable of slashing into Union supply lines, ambushing patrols, and disrupting entire campaigns. To Union commanders, Forrest's cavalry felt less like soldiers and more like ghosts, appearing suddenly in the rear, destroying critical resources, and then disappearing into the woods or hills before reinforcements arrived. His campaigns were not just military operations, they were psychological warfare. One of Forrest's earliest demonstrations of his refusal to surrender came at the Battle of Fort Donelson in 1862. As Union forces closed in and Confederate defenders prepared to capitulate, Forrest rejected the idea of giving up. Instead, he led his men through freezing rivers and hostile territory in a daring escape. This act not only saved his command, but also set the tone for his reputation. Forrest would never willingly submit. Even when surrounded, he believed there was always a way to fight or escape. But Forrest was not a man of defense. He was an attacker at heart, and his boldest victories came when he launched assaults against superior numbers. The Battle of Bryce's Crossroads in June 1864 stands as his masterpiece. Facing a Union army of more than 8,000 men, Forrest commanded only about 3,500. Outnumbered more than 2 to 1, he used the terrain with deadly precision. Forrest split the Union forces, attacked from multiple directions, and struck so rapidly that the enemy could not reform their lines. Panic spread. The larger Union army collapsed under the pressure of his relentless charges. Forrest's victory shocked the North. Here was a man with no formal training defeating generals who had studied strategy their entire lives. His men followed him with a loyalty born not from kindness but from example. Forrest was notoriously harsh, with a volcanic temper and a willingness to discipline through violence. Yet his soldiers respected him because he never asked them to do what he would not do himself. He fought in the front lines, often leading charges personally. He was wounded repeatedly, shot, slashed, and nearly killed more than once. Each time he returned to the saddle. His resilience, his sheer refusal to die, inspired the men who rode with him. But Forrest's legacy is forever stained by the events at Fort Pillow in April 1864. When his men stormed the Union-held fort in Tennessee, many of the defenders were African American soldiers. What followed was a massacre. Reports described hundreds of surrendering Union troops, many of them black, being gunned down, bayoneted, or executed after laying down their weapons. Survivors spoke of bloodletting that went far beyond the chaos of battle. Forrest and his defenders claimed that confusion and continued resistance justified the slaughter, but the sheer scale of the killings suggested otherwise. The event horrified the North. "Remember Fort Pillow" became a rallying cry for Union soldiers, a symbol of Confederate cruelty and racial hatred. The massacre ensured that Forrest's reputation would always be divided. To many in the South, he remained a hero, a daring cavalryman, a symbol of resistance, a general who fought with unmatched ferocity. To many in the North, and to history, he was marked as a war criminal, a man whose name was inseparable from atrocity. Despite this dark shadow, Forrest's tactical brilliance was undeniable. Even Union leaders admitted it. William Tecumseh Sherman, one of the most ruthless and brilliant commanders of the war, once described Forrest as the most remarkable man our Civil War produced. It was not praise. It was acknowledgment of an enemy too dangerous to dismiss. By the war's end, Forrest had become a legend. His reputation as "that devil Forrest" lived in the minds of Union soldiers who feared his raids, his sudden strikes, and his refusal to obey the conventions of war. He reshaped how cavalry was used, how raids were conducted, and how fear itself could be weaponized. Yet his story did not end on the battlefield. After the Confederacy collapsed, Forrest's life turned toward darker chapters that cemented his notoriety in American history. His involvement with the founding of the Ku Klux Klan tied his name forever to terror beyond war, a legacy of racial violence that outlived him and scarred the South for generations. Nathan Bedford Forrest was in many ways a paradox. He was uneducated yet brilliant in war. He was brutal yet charismatic enough to command loyalty. He was feared by his enemies, but often equally feared by his men. He rose from nothing to the highest ranks of the Confederate Army, rewriting the rules of combat through sheer will. His genius as a commander was undeniable, but his brutality ensured that his name would be remembered not only as a military innovator, but also as a symbol of cruelty. Forrest did not just fight battles. He reshaped how war itself was fought. His lightning raids, his psychological tactics, and his reckless aggression left scars on the Civil War that still echo in military history. But his darker actions, from Fort Pillow to his role in racial terror after the war, remind us that brilliance without morality can leave a legacy as feared as it is remembered. Forrest's strength came from more than raw aggression. It came from a deep, instinctive understanding of unconventional warfare at a time when most generals were trapped inside rigid formations and textbook strategies. While other officers measured victory by numbers and logistics, Nathan Bedford Forrest measured it by speed, chaos, and fear. He believed victory was never guaranteed to the largest army, but to the boldest one. Forrest tore the traditional military rule book apart and rewrote it with his own bloody script. He turned cavalry from a tool of movement into a weapon of terror, and wherever his horsemen galloped, the Union felt a shiver down its spine. After the Fort Pillow Massacre, in which Forrest's men slaughtered surrendering black Union soldiers, Union commanders understood just how dangerous he had become. They were desperate to stop him. They sent larger, better-equipped forces, hoping sheer size would be enough to crush him. But Forrest was elusive. He did not wait to be hunted. He was the hunter. He struck first, always. His raids reached deep into Union-held territory, tearing up railroads, burning supply depots, derailing trains, and vanishing into the wilderness before the enemy could regroup. These were not just attacks. They were lessons in fear. He called it raiding warfare. But the truth was darker. It was psychological. Forrest wanted every Union soldier to feel unsafe, even far behind their own lines. He wanted hesitation to creep into the minds of Union officers, and he succeeded. In late 1864, Forrest orchestrated one of his boldest moves, a coordinated attack on Union railroads across Tennessee and Mississippi. With only 500 men, he rode more than 300 miles in 10 days. His cavalry destroyed dozens of bridges, captured trains, burned warehouses, and seized supplies worth a fortune. And then, like a phantom, they disappeared, without losing a single man in a major engagement. It was the kind of operation that baffled traditional generals. To Forrest, it was simply proof that audacity and motion could overcome numbers. This kind of success required more than courage. It demanded relentless planning, precise timing, and ruthless discipline. Forrest was infamous for pushing his men beyond exhaustion, yet they followed him because he was always at the front, the first into the enemy's line. One Union survivor described him with haunting words. "You came like fire through dry grass. You could hear him shouting before you saw him, and once you saw him, you could not stop him." To fight Forrest was to fight inevitability itself. But the fear he inspired did not stop at the enemy's ranks. His own men lived in awe and terror of him. Forrest ruled with absolute authority, and disobedience was met with death. On one infamous occasion, during an argument about cowardice, Forrest shot and killed one of his own lieutenants. When questioned later, he gave a chillingly simple reply. He disobeyed a direct order in battle. That's death. His code was brutal, but it forged an army of riders who were tight, loyal, and ruthlessly efficient. Time and again, Forrest proved that he could win even when the odds were stacked against him. At the Battle of Johnsonville in November 1864, he faced a Union force that dwarfed his numbers. With only a few thousand men and a couple of improvised artillery batteries, he used deception as his weapon. Forrest had his men fire cannons in rotating shifts, moved artillery pieces constantly to give the illusion of a larger battery, and spread rumors of reinforcements. The Union commanders, convinced they faced overwhelming numbers, abandoned their position. Forrest's men swept in, capturing or destroying more than $6 million worth of supplies and equipment. It was a victory of smoke and mirrors, a reminder that Forrest's greatest weapon was often not his saber, but his ability to manipulate perception. Psychological warfare was his constant companion. Forrest understood that fear could paralyze armies faster than bullets. He used local scouts to spread exaggerated rumors of massive Confederate forces, forcing Union divisions to disperse in panic. While they scrambled to defend against phantom threats, Forrest struck their weakest points, always 2 steps ahead. To his enemies, he seemed everywhere at once, an unstoppable shadow who defied the laws of war. Union soldiers began calling him "that devil Forrest," a name that carried both fear and reluctant respect. Confederate newspapers praised him as a Southern knight, a man who embodied defiance when the Confederacy seemed doomed. Even Union generals could not deny his impact. Ulysses S. Grant, a man rarely given to praise, admitted that Forrest had made the war far harder than expected, and William Tecumseh Sherman, whose own march through Georgia would earn him infamy, declared that if he could clone Forrest, the Union would have ended the war a year sooner. Yet the same fire that made him formidable also made him unstable. His temper was volcanic, his discipline absolute, and his tolerance for weakness non-existent. He had no patience for retreat, negotiation, or hesitation. To Forrest, war was not a chessboard of rules. It was survival, and survival allowed no mercy. These qualities made him powerful, but they also isolated him. Even among Confederates, he was both feared and resented. Still, his legend continued to grow. Forrest became the embodiment of the South's refusal to bow, a symbol of fury that no surrender could extinguish. His name was whispered by Union soldiers on the march and sung by Confederates desperate for hope. He was myth and man at once, a living contradiction of brutality and brilliance. As the Civil War dragged into its final, bloody stages, Forrest faced a grim reality. The Confederacy was collapsing. Armies were surrendering, cities were burning, and the dream of independence was slipping away. Yet Forrest was not a man to lay down his sword quietly. When others accepted defeat, he gathered his cavalry one final time. Forrest's last ride was not about victory. It was about defiance. Even as Confederate leaders surrendered, Forrest urged his men to fight on. He believed that as long as he breathed, resistance could not truly die. For him, war had become more than battles. It was his identity, his existence, his creed. But history is cruel. No matter how bold, no matter how fearless, even that devil Forrest could not fight the tide of a collapsing nation. His raids dwindled, his men scattered, and at last he was forced to surrender. Yet his legend did not end there. Forrest's post-war life would twist into even darker chapters. His name forever tied to the founding of the Ku Klux Klan, a stain that shadowed his legacy far beyond the battlefield. Still, in the annals of war, Nathan Bedford Forrest remains a paradox, a man of ferocity and genius, a commander who defied logic and rewrote strategy, a warrior who built victories out of speed, fear, and audacity. His cavalry did not just ride through the South. They carved a place in history with fire, steel, and terror. And as the war ended, one truth remained. Forrest had shown the world that the enemy to fear most was not the one who outnumbered you, but the one who refused to play by the rules. As 1865 approached, the Confederacy was collapsing. General Robert E. Lee had surrendered at Appomattox. Southern cities were falling one by one, but Nathan Bedford Forrest did not believe in surrender. Not yet. His men still followed him, loyal to the bitter end, and Forrest was determined to keep fighting even when the war was already lost. His cavalry, though worn down by years of war, remained the most feared unit in the South. They moved fast, attacked hard, and vanished before Union forces could pin them down. Forrest began launching desperate rear guard actions, harassing Union supply routes, ambushing patrols, and trying to delay the inevitable fall of the South. But deep inside, even Forrest knew the war was ending. His letters became darker. He spoke of ruin, of loss, and of, 'cause that may not survive. His once proud raids had become acts of survival. Ammunition was low, horses were starving, and morale was sinking. But he still pushed forward. In one of his final operations, he led an ambush against a Union supply line in northern Mississippi. Though successful in disrupting the line and seizing valuable supplies, it came at a cost. His force was badly outnumbered, and during the retreat many of his men were captured. Still, Forrest escaped. Wounded, tired, and with fewer than 500 cavalrymen left at his side, he rode into Alabama, his final battlefield. On May 9, 1865, Forrest received word that Confederate President Jefferson Davis had been captured. The government was gone. The cause was gone. The war was over. But Forrest, ever the soldier, gathered what remained of his command and addressed them. He told them that further resistance was useless, that the war had been lost, and that they should return home. "Men, you have been good soldiers. You can be good citizens." Those words marked the end of his military career, but not the end of his legacy. After the war, Nathan Bedford Forrest returned to civilian life in Memphis. The South was in ruins. Forrest had lost most of his fortune. His properties were destroyed, and his reputation was divided. In the North, he was seen as a violent enemy general, a war criminal responsible for Fort Pillow. In the South, he was a symbol of defiance, celebrated in newspapers, praised in speeches, and remembered as a man who never gave up. But then came the darkest chapter. In 1867, just 2 years after the war, Forrest became associated with a new group formed by Confederate veterans in Pulaski, Tennessee. It was called the Ku Klux Klan. At first, it claimed to be a social club, a fraternity of ex-soldiers. But it quickly turned into something far more dangerous, a secret terrorist organization, spreading fear through night raids, lynchings, and racial violence. Forrest was named the first Grand Wizard, the national leader of the Klan. Under his leadership, the group spread rapidly across the South, targeting freed slaves, Unionists, and anyone who challenged the old social order. Forrest claimed later in life that he only intended it to be a protective group, that he lost control of what it became. In an 1871 congressional testimony, he said he had disbanded the Klan when it grew too violent. But by then, the damage was done. Whether he led it directly or not, Forrest's name had become tied to racial terror. The man who had led cavalry charges with unmatched brilliance had become the face of a movement that sought to undo the progress of Reconstruction. His legacy was no longer just about war. It was about race, power, and fear. In the years that followed, Forrest tried to remake his image. He gave public speeches urging reconciliation between North and South. In one famous appearance at a black political event in 1875, he shook hands with black leaders and called for unity. But for many, it was too late. The shadow of Fort Pillow and the Klan loomed too large. Forrest died in 1877, broken financially but still revered by many Southerners. Statues of him were built. Schools and roads were named after him. His battlefield victories were taught as legends. But his full story was often left out. The massacres, the fear, the role he played in dividing a wounded nation even further. To some, Nathan Bedford Forrest was a genius of war, a man who built an army from nothing and fought against impossible odds with unmatched skill. To others, he was a symbol of hatred, of violence without mercy, and of a cause built on the defense of slavery. But no one, not even his harshest critics, could deny this one truth. Forrest was the most feared general of the Civil War, not because of how many men he commanded, not because of his rank, because of how he fought, because of what he was willing to do, because no one ever truly knew where he would strike next. He was a man who did not follow the war. He dragged it behind him. As time passed after the Civil War, the legend of Nathan Bedford Forrest only grew darker and more complicated. His name began to appear in speeches, in Southern memorials, and in newspapers, not just as a general, but as a symbol of everything the Confederacy once stood for. He was remembered for his lightning raids, his refusal to surrender, and his unmatched ability to turn small, ragged forces into a nightmare for Union armies. But behind the legend was a man deeply shaped by the violence of his time, and a man who helped shape that violence in return. Forrest's legacy is unlike that of any other general from the Civil War. He did not just win battles. He waged psychological war. He knew the value of fear, and he used it the way others used bullets. Union commanders knew that when Forrest was in the area, no rail line was safe, no supply wagon was secure, no camp could sleep without watching the tree line. He was once pursued by 6 different Union generals at the same time, and escaped them all. His enemies described him with words not usually used for a human being. They called him a phantom, a shadow, a force of nature. He had a way of appearing where no one expected him, striking with terrifying speed, and disappearing before anyone could react. His cavalry moved faster than any other unit in the war, often riding day and night without rest, covering hundreds of miles to reach a target. Forrest did not see battle as a place for ceremony. He saw it as a place to destroy the enemy quickly, completely, and without hesitation. He once said, "War means fighting, and fighting means killing." That was not poetry. It was his law. But even within the Confederate command, Forrest was feared and sometimes hated. He disobeyed orders when he thought they were wrong. He insulted generals he considered weak. He fought with almost everyone at some point, including his own president, Jefferson Davis. Forrest believed in results, not rank, and he earned that freedom because he delivered those results again and again. And yet, for all his victories, Forrest's story ends not in glory, but in conflict. His role in the Fort Pillow Massacre continued to haunt him. Northern newspapers published testimony from survivors, many of them black soldiers, who told stories of being shot in the back while surrendering, burned alive in barracks, or executed while begging for mercy. Forrest denied that a massacre occurred, insisting the Union men refused to surrender. But historians, North and South, have long agreed that something far more brutal happened there. Even Forrest's own men, years later, admitted they saw things they could never forget. That reputation followed Forrest into his post-war years. As Reconstruction unfolded across the South and newly freed black citizens began voting, organizing, and rising, Forrest's name was used to threaten them. Whether he remained active in the Ku Klux Klan or not, the image of him as Grand Wizard remained. His legend became a tool of fear, carved into speeches, etched into the edges of Southern law. And yet, as his health declined, Forrest seemed to seek something resembling redemption. In 1875, at the age of 54, he stood before a gathering of black Americans in Memphis, former slaves, now free citizens, and gave a speech. He spoke of reconciliation. He said, "I came here with the jeers of some white people who think that I am doing wrong. I believe I can exert some influence and do much to assist the people in strengthening fraternal relations." He asked for unity. He even accepted a bouquet of flowers from a young black girl and reportedly kissed her on the cheek. That image, a former slave trader, a Confederate general, a Klan leader, speaking to and embracing freed slaves, seems impossible. And to many it was. Some historians see this moment as a man truly changed by war and old age. Others see it as a calculated performance, an attempt to soften a public image that had become too dark, even for the South to hold up with pride. Either way, Forrest died 2 years later in 1877 with his body failing and his country still divided. He was buried in Memphis under a statue built to honor his military service. The statue stood for more than a century, praised by some, reviled by others, and always surrounded by debate.